My name's Malcolm Hackett, and as well as being a director of BRI, I also chair the board of the community company which owns and operates the 5 local Bendigo Bank community bank branches. Last week, if you were in Hurstbridge attending the Wattle Festival, you would have seen Bendigo Bank people there. We give significant sponsorship to that event. And if you were down near the train station, you would have also seen the BRI tent, and yeah, you would have been able to have a talk to people there. Next week, our Diamond Creek branch will be supporting the Rotary Diamond Creek Town Fair, and BRI will also be there. Welcome to the 3rd Bushfire Resilience webinar of 2023, Reducing Risks for People and Houses. Tonight, our presenter is Justin Leonard, and he'll give us some pointers on reducing risks for houses, and that'll be followed by a discussion and question and answer session. And then Justin will deliver his second presentation about reducing risks for people, followed by a discussion and question answer session again, and we'll finish at 9 p.m. We're fortunate to have Justin with us again. He's given great service to these webinars. This series of presentations has been organised by Bushfire Resilience Incorporated, which is an independent, not-for-profit association focused on improving community awareness and preparedness for the threat of bushfire. These webinars have been organised on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. BRI acknowledges the traditional custodians of the many lands from which you join us tonight, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connection to the lands and waters across Australia. Please note that the webinars and the presenters are providing information, not advice. Our intention is to provide general information about risks to property, people and animals, and it's your responsibility to seek advice for your particular situation. This may be a sensitive topic for some people, and suggested services are shown on the screen. We'd like to thank our sponsors who've made these possible. The Bendigo Bank community bank branches at Diamond Creek, Hurstbridge, Eltham, Mernda, Doreen and Kinglake, the CFA, the Warrandyte Riverside Market, Nillumbik Shire Council, Safer Together, Rotary Diamond Creek, Rotary Eltham and Davey Pumps. Thank you for registering your interest and for submitting your questions in advance. You'll be able to ask questions as we proceed using the Q&A function, but please keep your questions short and to the point. These webinars are being recorded and everyone who's registered will be sent the link. Many of you will be familiar with the wealth of bushfire knowledge that Justin brings to the presentations, and as a result of more than 2 decades of research with the CSIRO, we're going to begin with Justin's presentation on reducing risks to houses. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks very much for that, Malcolm. So tonight we're going to present in a slightly different format. I'm actually going to talk to you and not present a whole series of slides like I have previously, because we're going to cover the topics of weather and house survival and refer back to a lot of the resources that we've previously covered in previous webinar series. So I guess most recently you would have heard a lot of discussion about what we're in for in the coming fire season, and the fact that we've been lucky enough to have 3 consecutive years of La Nina, which actually means wetter and cooler summers and winters. And they've certainly helped to moderate or buffer the the season's outlooks as we've gone through them, and we haven't had any sort of particularly bad fire events, particularly down here in Victoria over those times. That's a combination of luck and the priming effect that La Nina gives us with these wetter, cooler conditions. But unfortunately, that prospect is now diminishing with a fairly high likelihood that we're going to pivot to a El Nino event, which means drier and hotter conditions for the coming fire season. You might also hear of other things in the news called an Indian Ocean dipole, which is another large sort of climatic indicator that also relates to ocean temperatures and the way they sort of drive our climate trends. The Indian Ocean dipole is also going positive, and unfortunately, the combination of El Nino and a positive IOD actually mean that it's even hotter and drier than just having El Nino event on its own. So unfortunately, we will see progressive drying as we move through spring and into summer. And that's going to mean the different parts of the landscape dry out sooner and become fire prone at different rates. Now, obviously, some areas and some soil types and some vegetation types and whatnot will dry out sooner than others. So you really need to watch carefully how this unfolds for your local circumstance. Now, also what's interesting with this El Nino, it's a global effect. And while we've been enjoying cool, dry weather over here in Australia, our North American and South American colleagues have been suffering really bad, hot, dry summer fire weather seasons. And that's actually how it falls. So while we're enjoying cooler, wetter climates, America is dealt with the exact opposite, and that's why you'd notice quite a lot of severe weather conditions on that side of the world. So I guess what's important about El Nino is it's a primer. So it gives us dry conditions, but it doesn't actually mean that we've got a higher or lower chance of getting a really nasty fire weather event within that season. It just means that the circumstances around it are primed to give us, to make those shorter term severe weather events more nasty and prime and drive a fire harder through the landscape. What is, though, influencing the likelihood that we have these short extreme events occurring in a summer is climate change. And I guess over the last 3 years and many preceding years before that, our weather systems are getting warmer because of increased CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere. And really what that means is, while we've been enjoying, say, the last 3 years of relatively good reduced fire weather due to La Nina, unfortunately, the climate has been warming, but it hasn't been as obvious to us because we haven't had that direct feedback of those hotter, drier conditions. However, as we move through and we continue to have a warmer and warmer climate, we're going to unfortunately face an ever-increasing likelihood of those severe events within the fire season. So all indicators are that we could see some significant loss events in this coming summer, and as we move forward, if we see multiple El Nino summers going forward, we're going to see the landscape dry out even more and more through consecutive summers as well. Now, I guess the sting in the tail of La Nina that you would have heard quite prolifically within the in the news is that things grow really well in a La Nina season. So we're actually also coming into the summer with a lot of fuel load that will eventually dry out and can support significant fire spread through the landscape, and those grassy fuels will be present and quite continuous through the landscape. The increase that we're going to see, so we're seeing this warming trend over the last a number of years. The unfortunate scenario is that our global climate trend is going to continue to warm for many decades to come, even if we aggressively start to try and curb our global emissions. And that's because there's a lot of momentum in the system. So what we're putting into the atmosphere this year will continue to support warming and increase over the next few decades. So we're actually, unfortunately, going to face significant increases in fire weather severity due to global warming for a number of decades to come. Our best case scenario is that we will start to really significantly reduce carbon emissions, and that means after 2 or 3 decades, we'll see some moderation and hopefully decline in the fire weather severities. But if we continue in the path we're currently going, we'll actually see ongoing increases for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 decades right through to the end of the century and beyond if we don't mitigate. So I guess mitigation is pretty much essential, but it isn't going to be a panacea, at least in the short-term future. And I guess along with this warming climate, we're constantly being presented with new and unexpected observations in what it's bringing to our fire weather seasons. And I guess if we look back to the 2019-2020 summer fire season, we saw, particularly up around New South Wales and down into some parts of Victoria, we saw a very different type of fire season, which was actually a fire season that didn't actually have many periods within it where it was cool enough and wet enough for the fires to either go out themselves or for fire agencies to be able to effectively black out those fires. So it meant that fires that started in the beginning of our fire season actually persisted throughout an entire fire season. And that meant that we had really extensive spread and coverage of fires, because every time the wind did pick up, the fires would push and spread from the existing footprint that it had already covered. So rather than worrying about fires igniting or being lit within the fire season, there was always places that the fires would grow from when the weather picked up. Now that's a really scary prospect and something we haven't really seen previously, and it's something that's got a lot of I guess people in the fire hazard and risk space really concerned about these new and emerging paradigms that we haven't really been aware of up until we've actually observed them. Now, that particular fire season, luckily, didn't actually have any really catastrophic fire weather days within that entire season. There were certainly a couple of days where they forecasted catastrophic weather conditions, but those conditions luckily didn't actually eventuate. But if they did, then we would face a really, really serious run of fires, because there were so many places that the fires would immediately begin and grow from. So in a way, it was a really bad summer, but in a way, it could have been far, far worse. So some sobering thoughts about what we may be up for in the coming decades. Now, I'll move from fire weather, but please save up put in your questions about coming back to that topic. But I'll pivot from fire weather across to the specific attack mechanisms around structures. So like I've covered quite extensively in previous webinars, the really dominant attack mechanisms that you see when we're looking at fire danger ratings up to the level of extreme are sort of embers, radiation, flame, and surface fire. And of course, all of the secondary things that are ignited and burn due to that ember, radiation, and flame attack. As we move into a fire danger rating of catastrophic, we really have to seriously consider the implications of damaging winds, which are synonymous with moving up into that really severe, most severe fire danger rating scale, and the wind-borne debris that's carried by those winds. Now, the winds can act directly on structures and actually weaken them. So we're talking about sort of lifting roof tiles or dislodging sheets of steel or facade coverings. So it can actually open up or weaken structures, can even break windows. So we really have to think about adequacy for those things. And what's interesting is our building standards don't actually attempt to address the implications of that type of damage. In fact, our building standards actually only target or attempt to be effective for fire danger ratings up to the top of extreme. So you definitely get into sort of an all bets are off scenario once you get into catastrophic fire weather conditions. And if it's not already part of, I guess, anyone's bushfire plan, it certainly would be, I'd strongly emphasize the idea that not being in a bushfire prone area with your house on days that get to catastrophic, if not a lower level, is a very sound and robust approach to managing your life safety. And while we're on the topic of regulation and what they do and don't cover, it's probably important to highlight that that these building standards like AEST 3959 are really minimum compliance building standards, and they actually seek to increase the likelihood that your house survives, but they certainly aren't seeking to ensure your house will survive. And if we're looking at, say, what level of success the building standards are actually aiming to achieve, they're actually aiming for a survival rate of at least 80%. So 80% survival rate in a fire, noting, I guess, that houses that aren't built to regulation are typically experiencing a survival rate of around 60%. So it's actually only a fairly modest improvement in the survival prospect of your house. And that may be a surprise to some. And I guess I'd probably say that it would be probably not necessarily meeting quite a lot of homeowners' expectations or the expectations of the neighbours to those houses that are built relatively close. So I guess that helps to emphasise the idea that maybe the regulations that aren't necessarily the best, I guess, guide for trying to achieve a highly reliable and robust house design. I'd certainly point people more to the emerging bushfire best practice guides that provide a more sort of comprehensive guide to house and landscaping design. And I guess that in it sort of describes how and why building standards on their own and the way they overlook things like wind damage and wind loads and all those secondary ignition processes help sort of explain why they're only really achieving an 80% survival rate rather than a much higher level. So, and I'd also sort of to point you back to, say, our webinar series, I think it was webinar series 1 back in 2021, really gives you a detailed profile of what to go through and understand in and around your property for its design. And that sort of helps you sort of, I guess, guide you through those processes of looking sort of in the broader landscape and then the immediate landscape around your structure and then the actual structure and structure design itself. So I guess in doing this, sort of creating the key takeaway here, I guess, is creating that culture of preparedness for your household. And I guess making sure each and every one of your initiatives around trying to improve your home, the housekeeping efforts around your home and in the immediate landscaping, the way you consider upgrading your gardens and your garden layouts can all help to dramatically improve your house survival. And in doing so, can also be very clever ways to improve the prospects that you can survive either in that house or survive even in the event that your house actually ignites by providing the effective ways to leave your house and find other places of secondary sort of shelter around your property. So I'll pause there and we might move to a bit of Q&A around that first topic.
Do you want to say something about your background, which is pretty dramatic?
That's one of my favourite backgrounds. I stole from a newspaper article, which was a house burning down in one of the floods we've experienced through our La Nina period. And it's actually, it's quite common for houses to actually burn down in floods due to leaking gas that's been structurally damaged, and even power shorts and things that cause things to burn down. So yeah, food for thought.
Sure is. You talked about those La Nina summers that we've had, and I think I wouldn't be alone in having been lulled into a sort of complacency, even though I've been through a bushfire and I do these webinars and all the rest of it. That my bushfire preparations, I'm sure, weren't adequate during that time because things didn't seem threatening. I'm pretty motivated this year, I can tell you. Are you coming across, those sorts of attitudes that people forgot what it was like and now they're getting ready?
Yeah, definitely. I think the lack of sort of constant reminders of what a bad fire season can be sort of occurs. People get a little bit more complacent, and I guess the disappointing thing I see is the missed opportunities, because people are sort of less considerate of those of preparing for fire events. They're making choices around, you know, upgrading a retaining wall or something like that, and using, you know, fire-prone materials rather than using it as an opportunity to reduce the fire proneness of their immediate landscape. So I think preparedness is a really long-term, you know, whole of life journey that we really can't afford to be complacent, even when we've enjoyed a couple of nice, cool, wetter summers.
This one question connects, I think, pretty well with what you were talking about there. This person says, in a Bell 40 forest area, our extension required composite weatherboard at least 9mm thick instead of timber weatherboards. We have timber stud walls and blue reflective paper. How effective is this material in a bushfire? Meaning, I presume, the 9mm thick stuff in particular.
Yeah, so the cladding itself obviously doesn't present a fuel load or an ignition risk to your structure. The main challenge there is how well that facade is sealed. So how well does that facade actually protect the combustible building cavities that sit behind it, because you do have a timber frame, and the blue sarking paper actually is itself doesn't necessarily burn continuously when you ignite it, but it doesn't actually offer a significant barrier to debris build up and flame ignition on it. Holes will burn through it fairly readily. So keeping your facade in good condition and looking very carefully about the details of where those facade boards end, like down near the floor level and around the corners and where it meets the eaves, is a real trick to getting the most out of that facade design.
We've talked before, and there is a question here about which touches on it. I think there's two questions. What's the best practice for storing gas bottles? This person says we place ours inside an external pizza oven with a steel door. But there's also another question here. What do you do with solar batteries in the case of a bushfire? Do you want to tackle both of those?
Yeah, I'll do the gas one first. So quite a clever idea to put it inside a pizza oven. It's great at keeping heat in, and for the very same reason, it's exceptionally good at keeping heat out. So it's one of those clever places to store either highly flammable items or to store your valuables. A gas bottle is relatively safe if it's put out away from other heavy fuel sources. It can survive a relatively short passage of the fire, like some low-level grass burning past it. But it doesn't fare well at all when it's placed up against something that's going to burn for a long time, like a retaining wall or a vehicle or a house. Also, it is extremely dangerous for those gas bottles to fall over, because they can't, if they heat up sufficiently, they can't actually vent and reduce their pressure in an effective way, and they become an explosion risk if they're actually allowed to fall over and then continue to be heated. So that's another reason to get them away from buildings and away from elements that can burn, fall on them or knock them over. And another good reason why securing them to a non-combustible structure, like a steel post in the ground with a metal chain securing them upright, is a really good idea. You'll also notice that those gas bottles have a vent. That's the vent that helps them relieve pressure and avoid explosion. Having thought to the way that vent is orientated, so it points away from things that would suffer if they were impacted by a gas flare or an egress route that you might be considering planning as a secondary exit. You want to avoid as well. Your other question was around batteries. If you've had a battery installed, you'll notice that there's quite a lot of consideration around the location of that battery and what it's attached to, and that's consideration of whether the battery itself has any fault or failure and becomes a potential ignition source. It does quite a bit to try and contain that to a small area and not lead to burning your house down. Those same design considerations mean that there's not a lot of combustible material that is immediately next to those batteries. So in a bushfire event, they actually help to some extent limit the likelihood that the battery is going to get involved. That being said, though, there's a lot that can be done from a broader bushfire safety perspective to keep those heavy fuel elements away from the battery, so it's not presented with a massive heat exposure risk.
There's two more related questions here. One person says, I'm going to fit metal screens over the air vents under our brick subfloor house. What sort of mesh should I use? And another person that's concerned about the whirlybirds on the roof. How can they? What sort of materials can they use to stop embers getting into those?
So I guess in both cases, a fine metal mesh flywire screen is a really good choice. Something like stainless is going to give you a really good design life, but it's also particularly strong even if the wire gauge is very fine. 2 mil or smaller aperture between those strands of wire give you a fine enough screen so that the embers that try to get through those, if any do get through, they're so small that they have very little to no chance of igniting anything combustible behind it. So yeah, 2 mil or finer aperture stainless mesh would be the go-to, but other types of metal mesh would be feasible as well.
This next question's about sealing gutters by filling them with water. If it is useful, what's the best way to do it? This person's dubious about the efficiency of tennis balls. And I must admit, tennis balls have been the go-to since I was a child, I think.
I've noticed that there's quite a lot of diversity in gutter and downpipe design. So square downpipes, round downpipes, different diameters. Also different styles of gutters and the way they're set on eaves. So in some cases, if you fill a gutter up right to the top, it'll actually flood back into your ceiling. So certainly, work through this process quite carefully, but provided you can get any amount of water to sit in your gutter and most of your gutter around your house, the means for achieving that are many and varied. I've seen some very clever ways of putting essentially a gate valve or a ball valve in the downpipe as well, which is another way of doing it at ground level, which obviously avoids the safety or issues or awkwardness of getting up to the gutter level itself to put something in it or block it off. But of course, there's only certain downpipes that lend themselves to that type of approach. I think the other ideas of sort of pumping water up onto your roof so it's actually running through your gutters down into your downpipes and then being collected and then repumped back up isn't a bad idea as well.
Yes, the hardware stores seem to have lots of plug style things, and I guess you've just got to go looking for them, don't you, really?
Yeah.
And tennis balls will work if you've got the right diameter, I presume. Are there professionals geared up to install mist sprayers inside roof spaces? Ever heard of that?
It's certainly a really interesting and useful idea. I think we've touched on it in some previous webinar series as an idea, a novel idea. I haven't come across anyone that's professionally attempting to do that, but I hope that, you know, the industry sort of cottons on to that as a bit of an idea and starts to formalize that as an approach.
I haven't heard of it, I must say. How much of a house's survival is dependent on the construction standards compared to the annual preparation and preparedness around the house? Is a well-prepared house with active defenders more important than a well-built house?
I would say the combination of the two is obviously the ultimate solution. A lot of houses many houses that aren't sort of deliberately built in their first instance to survive a fire have so many, I guess, weak aspects to them that there's a huge task for many able-bodied adults to address all of those simultaneous ignition challenges. So I guess there's no really right or wrong answer to say one's more than the other, but the combination of very carefully preparing a house for a fire and then actively defending it is obviously a lot more effective than simply trying to actively defend and overcome all of those shortcomings, that many of which ideally should have been addressed by sort of passive fixes and design details that can be readily addressed, you know, not during the fire event itself.
I think that's really sound advice, because my experience is if you don't have those passive things in place, you just run off your feet trying to attend to everything, which is impossible, and you can't keep it up. And you really do need an army of people to make it happen. It's a good question here about our house is about 500 millimetres above ground on concrete stumps with a timber floor. The external barrier around the house is plinth boards with a 20 millimetre gap. We live in a BAL 12 area. What modifications should we make?
So I guess your two strategies there are to either consider protecting your entire subfloor area from attack from underneath, or to fully enclose your subfloor area and try and make it an ember-proof space underneath, which comes with its own range of challenges, like how do you keep that area well ventilated? You certainly don't want sort of moisture and mildew build up if you fully enclose it and not adequately ventilate that, which you can ventilate with the right meshes and the right sort of attention to the to having enough sort of airflow, you know, ember protected vents around that area. So I guess, and on top of that, I guess if you go for something like an open subfloor space that's the subfloor itself is protected, you want to be really diligent about A, not storing anything under there, and B, watching for debris accumulation, because it's the amount of the size of the fire that could occur under there that would then define whether the amount of protection you've applied to your floor is adequate. you weren't specific in saying whether your plinth boards were ignitable or not, but I'd assume, like most houses, they would be timber plinth boards with a 20 mil gap. I'd say almost certainly replacing those timber plinth boards with non-combustible ones or removing them altogether would help significantly as well. That kind of fire load on its own is enough to threaten your subfloor, even if it's protected, and also other areas like your deck and facade of your structure.
There's two questions here about fire bunkers, and people can refer back to our 2022 webinar when we, I think it was webinar 3, where we talked about last resort options. So there's something to follow up there. But this person says, being on a dead end road, if you do not have a bunker, what do you recommend to people if they cannot get away?
Upgrade your house to be extremely reliable. Also plan all of your strategies in the event that your house actually does ignite while you're using it as a shelter, like where to go in the house if and when it starts to burn, when exactly you'd exit, how you'd exit that structure, what path you would take, and what other places on your property would offer you some degree of shelter. What's your strategy once leaving the house? Like straight into a vehicle, park the vehicle in an open area. You need all of those things really adequately sorted out. Also having a really sound understanding, like has already been demonstrated, that the prospects of getting out on the road beyond your property are really challenging and should never be attempted once the effects of fire are in the immediate landscape. It's really down to making the most out of your immediate surroundings and what you've got as shelter options at hand.
But yeah, I'd recommend that people have a look at that webinar. It goes into those options and strategies. This person has asked, related, is a fire escape bunker recommendable as protection for people? Any cons to be mindful of?
So a regulated and properly installed approved bunker offers quite a high degree of safety. They're designed specifically for that purpose, and there's a lot of, I guess, design redundancy built into those regulated bunkers. So I would say they do offer a high degree of reliability, and provided they're used in an effective way, like you've got to be in them well before the effects of fire are around. You need to get in them while the air's clean effectively around the bunker, and you don't want to try and get into a bunker or be at risk while you're trying to get from a house to a bunker. So that there's many factors around it, being able-bodied and well, and have it part of a really reliable plan. But it's a really useful prospect to consider when for many people.
We've got a poll question. So if people would like to respond to that, we're really grateful that we've got such a strong audience, and we really want you to help us get the message out there to other people. So we'd ask that you please encourage your friends, community groups that you're involved in, people who are living with a bushfire risk, to register and become a subscriber. Then they'll get informed when the recordings are available, and they'll become aware of the things that are on our website. Please follow our Facebook page and share our posts if you're a Facebook user. And we really do thank the numerous people, groups and individuals around Australia who've shared the post before this webinar to get the message out. We'd strongly urge you to explore our website, where you'll find the bite-sized segments of each of the previous 16 webinars. There's quite a bit of information there. There's also interviews with people who've been through bushfires, and there's transcripts. So if you're uncertain about something, you can read it, find out what they said in print. And there's also a search engine, so you can put in topics like subfloors or bunkers, and the information, if you use the keywords, up it'll come, and you'll be able to find out what's been said before. Also, please support our fundraising raffle, because that'll enable us to continue. There's 2 grand prizes comprising Davey Firefighter single impeller pumps and a Bunnings gift voucher. And if you have a look on our website, the details are there. The feedback surveys that people complete are really important to us, because they enable us to provide you with high quality information that's tailored to what people want to know.
Thanks, Malcolm. Also, I guess worth mentioning is the pre-webinar survey that was sent out, and the fantastic response to that survey, with over 200 individual responses to it. I might just move through some of the highlights of those answers, because they're quite informative around this topic of sort of house and person survival. Out of the question around identifying easy and inexpensive house risk reduction options, over 73% of respondents actually identified that that they had pursued those risk reduction options and identify them. And I guess 41% also mentioned that the checklists would be really helpful. So I guess some of the previous webinar webinars help sort of define what those checklists could involve, but I'd also encourage you to look up building best practice guidelines. CSIRO has one, and I'll try to get a link attached to this webinar to help you find that, and in that they can help you navigate those checklists. The next question was identified time-consuming or expensive house risk reductions. Around 70% actually identified, said yes, and another 44 said there was a checklist. So sort of that risk is the range of sort of inexpensive ones. Yes, people have sort of looked into those, and then I guess how they trickle down to those more expensive, time-consuming ones is slightly less, but quite a few people have pursued that. The next one is, have you actioned any of those time-consuming ones? And nearly 50% had, so quite a lot of, I guess, diligent, proactive people within the survey group, which is great. How many of the surveyors have taken, have identified vegetation risk reduction actions near around their house? Nearly 90% said yes, so that's fantastic. But 30% of all those respondents also mentioned that a checklist would be really handy to help them navigate that. How many of the respondents have noted that they had houses designed and constructed to recent building regulations like AEST 3959? Quite a few. The 42% actually had regulated structures. So this discussion around what regulation achieves, I think is quite relevant, given that many responded. And I guess for those that are sort of thinking about using those construction guides as a retrofitting guide, you know, a word of warning, and I'd encourage you to sort of look carefully at those building best practice guides as, say, an ultimate guide. Looking at other things, the topic of do people store things under their house? Thankfully, quite a few don't. The vast majority don't. So that message is getting through quite well. Roofing materials were quite predominantly metal roof, like 77% metal roof, 24% tile. I guess metal roofs are significantly easier to seal up and ember proof because you don't have that issue of small gaps between each tile. But quite a few of the people with either roof type sort of recognised that there was still significant work to do for sealing those roofs up, as well as other roof details like skylights and evaporative coolers. Vast majority of decking around the structures were timber, either in the support structure and the materials that the deck itself was made out of. That's concerning in the timber decks are quite prolifically involved in bushfire, and they're also quite challenging when you start to think about which ways you'd actually consider exiting a house and whether you need to exit over a deck. If that deck's on fire, it very quickly rules that out as a safe exit path, and similarly with stairs. Around bushfire, around vegetation, quite a high proportion, 52% of people identified that they had trees or tree limbs that were close enough that if they fell, they could impact the house. And it's worth noting that in a bushfire context, trees fall over quite regularly and limbs fall off trees quite regularly, and that's because fires find and exploit the knots and the details in various trees that can burn out and cause them to either fall over or lose limbs. Arborists and tree experts are quite good at identifying which trees have a higher propensity to do that than others. So if you really want to retain certain trees, then please get them looked at by professionals. Quite a large proportion had bushes within 2 meters of windows. So we're talking about 58% of respondents. That's quite concerning because I guess there's good bushes and bad bushes, but if windows in that proximity to that type of vegetation can definitely be a risk. So look very carefully at whether that's a threat, referring to things like the CFA plant key can help you understand and unpack whether that bush is going to behave problematically in a bushfire or in a relatively benign way. 26% had tan bark within 1 to 2 meters of the house itself. That's definitely something to have a serious think about, because even just the tan bark burning itself is enough to crack windows or present a significant heat load to structures.
Rowan, can you put the answers up for the poll question?
So how does weather affect the vulnerability of your house? Very low percentage, if not at all. Fantastic to see. 7% hardly, 19% moderate, 60% a lot. So we're definitely looking at a very well-enlightened audience. The obvious answer is that the weather that's responsible for drying out vegetation and priming the landscape to support a fire are doing the exact same things to your house and all the elements around your house at the same time. So so all aspects of your house are at maximum dryness and combustibility at the same time that the landscape's primed to support a fire. So we have to really keep reminding ourselves about that unfortunate alignment of a house becoming most vulnerable at the same time that fires become most prevalent in the landscape, and is sort of that double reason why looking very carefully at the combustible elements within, under, and attached to your structure is a really key focus to managing house vulnerability.
Thanks, Justin. We better push on. We're going to run out of time, I can see.
That's all right. I
so-
can blitz this last one.
You go for it.
So moving on to a people perspective, from the house perspective, I've sort of touched on it quite a few times, but let's put ourselves in a situation where we've done a significant amount of preparation. We've got a plan, but that plan's unfolded, and you happen to be at home and you've recognized that the fire is impending, and that your option to safely be completely away from a bushfire prone area has passed, and you're actually presented with the inevitability of having to use your house as a shelter to try and get through that fire. What that means is active monitoring, and we've had some very good previous webinar series that talk about what active sheltering means. I think it was webinar 5 in the year 2021. Very, very worthwhile to go back and refresh yourself around what exactly active sheltering, rather than simply picking a room in that house and staying, actually is. The reason why you're actively monitoring and moving around the house is because all parts of the house are survivable in a bushfire. So there's very little risk in roaming around inside that structure and keeping an eye out for any signs. Now, if something happens, you may be within your means to suppress it or put it out or cover something up or protect a window that's cracked or something like that. So that's the other part of actively sheltering. It's sort of actively defending from the inside. But it's also about recognizing whether some aspect of the house is ignited and is likely to develop into an entire house fire, which really means that the clock has started to tick down for when that house will be untenable, and you'll be no longer able to use it to survive. So you have to start planning your exit from that house, and that planning should have occurred long before that fire event. You need to have thought about these scenarios about planning an exit strategy, of which you should have more than one exit strategy from a structure, and particularly what that exit strategy means, which door, what route, to where, and what your options are when you get to those other locations are all key, but very well covered in that work package 5 to refresh yourself. I guess those sheltering options, and of course, those sheltering options are really about keeping you away from radiant heat and other sources, about minimizing your exposure to smoke and superheated air, and your options for sort of moving into a car, which can be sort of driven around and parked in open spaces or moving to water bodies and things are all really key things to consider. I guess, and that sort of really broadens that idea of not just thinking about getting your house through this event. It's about getting your house through the event, but also expanding the range of options you have to maximize your chance if you're presented with this exact situation where you're doing your best to survive within your house, but you're also planning for the unfortunate scenario that your house might not survive the entirety of that event, and you need all of these contingent backup plans to get through. And when you're faced with all that scenarios and all those planning, it does then trickle down to your personal circumstance, how well you've equipped yourself with the proper personal protective gear, what you're doing to make sure you have enough lighting and water and other processes, and how you've put appropriate plans in place for the people and pets you that may be dependent on you to get through that event with you. So how does your whole collective household work together to ensure you're all going to get through the process together?
There's some terrific questions here, so we might just launch straight into them. But I know from personal experience that that what you think is going to happen doesn't happen. And in our last webinar, Danielle Claude talked about expecting the unexpected, which is pretty hard to do. It's the unknown unknowns. But what are the unexpected things that you hear about that catch people out?
Yeah. I guess what I hear a lot of, I guess, accounts of what people faced, and it's things like, I never expected how much impending darkness there is as the fire front passes. So, and I guess how visually obtrusive all of the smoke blankets out and disorientates people very quickly. So even though it's their own place, they're really intimately aware of where everything is. They lose all of their reference points and find it actually really hard to just navigate around. The other aspect is the incredibly oppressive noise and the impact that noise has, both mentally and emotionally, to sort of think. So communication outside is really difficult, and it's really oppressive. Also, I think the degree to which people gain confidence in having or knowing other people are nearby doing similar things. So it's kind of two people are in the front yard trying to wet down vegetation. One person drops the hose and disappears, either inside or somewhere else. The other person then feels quite vulnerable and alone, and starts making, I guess, less formal plan decisions that are rational, and making sort of more reactive and emotional decisions. So I think people are presented with sort of really mentally stressed and taxing scenarios that sort of challenge. And I think that's why having these really well-rehearsed, logical, trusted plans that are embedded in everyone's minds really become important, because hopefully they fall back to those practical decision hierarchies, rather than sort of making quite sort of spur of the moment fight and flight ones, which tend to have people heading around sort of less rational, high risk sort of evacuation strategies and things.
So that suggests that you should practice things, even like practice leaving your house to get to a point that you've identified is going to be safer than the house burning down. And you should do it well, before a fire comes. How many times would you practice something like that? What sort, what amount of things should you practice in terms of your plan?
Well, I'd practice every aspect of the plan, and I'd practice it sort of at least once or twice coming into each summer, and I'd constantly think about the interplay between what you're doing to prepare your house and your landscape and how well that works in with your plan. So things like assume you can't see anything and work out and then like close your eyes or and work out how hard it's to navigate out your front door, down the stairs and along a pathway to a place you know you need to get to, and what you can do in those areas like hand railing and the textured finishes you put on the ground to help you navigate, even if you're blinded. It's sort of all of those interesting scenarios and options are really well worthwhile when it comes down to actually doing it for real.
Now, this is a very specific question, but I'm sure it could easily apply to other circumstances. This person wants to know if we cannot exit safely, say in a sudden fire, and I have MS and cannot walk far in the heat, what's my best personal preparation to survive? And this particular house has roof sprinklers.
Okay, so it's certain that a house, once it starts to burn down and involves internal furnishings and fixtures, it will be untenable and it will involve the entire house. There's no other way that scenario will unfold. So to work out how best to plan for that, you obviously need to proactively plan to be near an exit. If you're mobility impaired, you need to be near an exit as soon as practical to minimize the time it takes for you to exit if you have to exit. But that exit strategy could be really well thought out. Like you might exit directly into a carport that's devoid of any combustible material other than your car, and you might exit directly into the car, and you might need to sort of ideally shield that carport from other impending fire exposure. So you're leaving a house for a car, which then offers you quite a lot of protection, and then you can move to various parts around the yard. But I think every scenario is unique, and I think that it'd be really good to sort of work through that specific scenario with a series of learned people that have gone through this process to get some sort of expert advice to make the most of your plan.
We've got some more questions here that relate to, well, to cars firstly, and then to sprinklers. First question, if leaving vehicles behind when evacuating, should they be parked away from the house or left in a garage or a carport?
So so there's a sort of a mutual exposure risk issue. So you put any combustible item like a car next to a structure. If the car is the first thing to burn, then the car has enough fuel load associated with it that it could burn down the structure it's parked next to. You really need to ideally separate objects by something like 6 to 10 meters to start to manage the risk that they could mutually burn each other down. I guess a car, and then I guess the question is the car more important or the house more important? If yeah, so you've got to sort of think through those things. Cars out in an open area on a non-combustible surface certainly do significantly better than parked on dry grass or on any combustible material or near a combustible thing like a fence or a retaining wall or another structure. So I think separation is the best thing, but particularly pay attention to what is under the vehicle.
This issue of sprinklers, what part can they play in helping people if they're unable to leave? What's the best configuration, and is there guidance on how to set up sprinkler systems?
So I assume this is referring to what we call domestic or residential sprinklers, which are the sprinklers and sprinkler heads within the building. So a bit similar to how commercial premises have sprinkler heads with those little alcohol vials that break and deploy. A residential sprinkler system is a really practical idea in a bushfire, noting though that water supply is often compromised, so you can't rely on town's water pressure, say, to supply that sprinkler system. But if you've gone to the trouble of building a good bushfire defence system with stored water, reliable pumping system, and all of those other aspects that we've covered in previous webinars, the upgrade of that kind of system to include residential sprinkler heads within the house that activate either within roof cavities or within individual buildings throughout individual rooms throughout the house is a really practical idea, and in some cases could actually mean the difference from the house igniting and putting itself out versus igniting and progressing fairly rapidly to being completely untenable. So I think that's well worth it, but be careful to make sure you have adequate pressure for that system and a reliable pressure supply to make the most of it.
You've talked a lot in the past about sprinkler systems on the outside of homes that say point in the wrong direction, so the water just goes up in the air and disappears and so on. There, I presume, are people around who are skilled at putting up a regulated or registered or whatever it is sprinkler system that is more likely to be effective, or do you just go looking in the white pages? Sorry, online.
Yeah, obviously I can't recommend any particular person, but if they are following a formal guideline and standard on how to fit them, then it's a lot better than not. And I think you have to sort of use your intuition to pick the most skilled and diligent of that group, and to have a good hard think about how that sprinkler system, external sprinkler system, might behave under really aggressive windy conditions, because I see the vast majority of systems fitted in the past end up delivering quite fine water sprays that are very readily carried away in the wind, away from the structure they're hoping to defend. So therefore, the water's essentially wasted. But heavy streams of water and jets that hold up to strong winds that deliver onto the surfaces of the house that you're trying to protect is the kind of strategy you'd want to adopt in thinking about a sprinkler design. And that actually means thinking less about putting the sprinkler heads on the house itself, and more thinking about putting sprinkler heads in the proximity of the house, spraying back at the house and also out into the landscape using really solid jets of water, similar to like you might notice a lot of those sort of chopper sprinklers that they're called impact head sprinklers. Farmers use those to irrigate their paddocks, and they hold up really well even under really windy conditions.
We've got a question here about, well, if you're sheltering in your house from radiant heat, but you know that it's compromised, at what point should you decide to leave? You know, when's it more dangerous inside than outside? How do you make that decision?
So what'll happen once the house starts to become involved is smoke will build up in the house. Closing off areas using your internal doors will help limit the rate that smoke builds up throughout the house. But what the smoke will do is will start to build up around the roof and then descend throughout all parts of the house. So the breathable air within the house will get lower and lower and closer to the floor. So getting to an exit and getting low will be your best strategy. And you pretty much want to try and use the house for as long as possible, that it's going to provide you that tenable conditions, because that's giving the fire the maximum amount of time outside to have passed its peak and to start improving. So you're trying to sort of maximize your chance of getting a transition into a burnt out landscape to move into. But you certainly don't want to risk getting caught significantly away from an exit or being exposed to too much toxic smoke buildup within the house that you're going to be impaired so much that you won't be able to safely exit.
I might add, in my experience too, I don't know whether the house was distorting, but I had trouble opening interior doors. They seemed to somehow be stuck. I don't know if it was an old weatherboard farmhouse, and it could easily have been distorting, and that was pretty scary, I might say. Would a dam be safer than a car if you were exiting to somewhere? What would make your decision about whether you go into a dam or go into a car?
Yeah, good question. Very sort of related to the actual specifics of the circumstance, but if I had a car and a dam to work with, I would probably choose to stay in the car and park the car next to the dam, and use the car in a similar way to this described with the house, is because the car is a complete sort of enclosed atmosphere where you've got some relatively clean air in it and quite a good radiant heat shield around you. You try to use that to the extent you could, but if the car actually became involved, then you've got the option then to exit and get into the water body as another backup.
If you were going to shelter in a car, what would be the steps you would take? You know, you get into the car. What do you do?
You would make sure you're not pumping fresh air from externally in. So turn it on to recirculation, or put it into recirculation mode so you're not bringing in smoky air outside. Running the engine and the air conditioner isn't a bad idea, and using the car to, if you can see around you, driving the car slowly to places that give you the best separation and distance from other burning items is really useful. But if it's difficult to see, if you can't really see, then not moving the car isn't recommended at all. and getting down low below the window line and covering up with woolen blankets and things give you the maximum chance of surviving, but also being careful to monitor whether the car's actually beginning to become involved in a fire itself means a similar thing to sort of monitoring a house. You really have to recognize if and when the car itself might start to lose tenability, and you might need to plan your exit.
There's a question here. Are cars likely to start to burn first, or might they just explode?
Burn first.
So you would have some indication that things aren't good.
That's right. Things like tyres and tail lights and engine bays start to burn first. The cars only really tend to explode once they become well involved in fire, and things like the gas tank or the fuel tank or the battery get really, severely heat exposed. It's only in those advanced stages that you'd move to an explosion risk.
Now this is getting off the vehicles, and we're back into the bush. We live in a very bushy and treed town. How can we help residents to know when to evacuate, despite all the efforts to reduce risk of fire attacking our homes? So this is more of a community issue, I suppose. How can you know when to tell people to evacuate as their street becomes compromised?
I guess the ideal time to evacuate is before there's any direct threat to your place, to the region, and that you've got full confidence that you can get from your current location to a place of safety without having any risk of being exposed in transit. Once the fire is active within the township, you often don't have any real clarity about where the fire exactly is and is not. And I wouldn't suggest anyone try to move around or through the landscape once you get to that point. You're really working in a very localized way. So, it's like preemptively not being there is the ultimate strategy. And I guess for every particular township, there's better places to be in that area than others. So understanding what the local reasonable places are is worth knowing, but also noting that even getting to those localized places, you need a very high degree of awareness that it's safe to even make those short trips before you consider seriously doing it.
One of the questions that we didn't get a chance to ask you before was, are there any recommended fire-resistant or retardant wood paints or liquids that you can use to increase the fire resistance of your home?
Yes, there's quite a range of different types. And I guess you've got to sort of take each of those ones with careful consideration and look at the degree that they've been tested and verified to perform. But noting that each of those coatings will weather and degrade in their effectiveness over time. So you have to pay close attention to how much duration of protection you're going to get, like how many seasons they'll last, and whether you need to recoat and reapply to keep them effective. Also noting that they only protect up to a certain amount. Like it's you know, you've got a combustible material, you're putting a thin coating over it. There's a point where too much heat will mean that the underlying timber could break down off gas, and at that point it's going to push the coating off and it's going to peel, blister and flake away and reveal the underlying combustible material. And it's also worth noting that the paint coatings don't necessarily seal up all the gaps, and the underside or back face of those timber facade elements aren't protected, and you've got just as much chance of a internal cavity fire as you had before you put the external coating on.
Thanks, Justin. We've run out of time. Once again, you've been terrific at answering our many and varied questions, and we really appreciate it. You're going to receive a short and confidential feedback survey, and we'd really appreciate it if you took a few minutes to respond. The audience response has been terrific in the past, and it really does help us to provide the sort of information that's both useful to you, and it gives us hints about which experts we should ask. I'd like to acknowledge Max Garner, Max Coleman, Mark Gravel, John Huff, Alan Bloom, Peter Mildenhall, Lisa O'Brien, Rob Reed-Smith, Jason McFadden and Tammy Garrett for their commitment in conducting this webinar series and in maintaining that very informative website. And special thanks to Rowan Thornton, who's our Zoom host, for his technical assistance and his advice. And also to Arthur Coates and Kathy Overton for their help. And you'll note that our group grows with every series. The number of people who are assisting us is fantastic. Our next webinar is on Wednesday, the 13th of September at 7:30 Australian Eastern Standard Time, and it will be titled Grass Fire and Bushfire Behaviour, and that's with Kevin Tolhurst and Justin Leonard. That, given the weather report that Justin gave us, is going to be really important to get a handle on. So we hope to see you then. Thank you and good night.